Welcome to today's webinar, Reselling Microsoft SPLA and Cloud, sponsored by Scott & Scott LLP, an intellectual property and technology law firm located in Southlake, Texas, recently named Technology Law Firm of the Year, USA. Your presenter, Rob Scott, managing partner, has been representing mid-market and large enterprise clients in high-stakes software licensing transactions and disputes for more than a decade. Rob has defended over 500 software audit matters involving Microsoft licensing. He was recently named Technology Lawyer of the Year, USA by Lawyer Monthly. Today's presentation will be recorded, and you will receive a link in the next day or two. Please enter any questions in the question box, and Rob will answer as many as time allows. Tomorrow, you'll receive a short survey requesting feedback and your ideas for future topics. We'd appreciate hearing from you. And now here is Rob Scott.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining the presentation on Reselling Microsoft SPLA and Cloud. My name is Robert Scott, and I'm glad to have you with me for the next hour. We'll be talking about a little-known issue involving Microsoft licensing that has been around for quite a while, but has come into particular focus in light of the trend toward cloud computing and hosting. It's referred to as the Service Provider License Agreement. You'll hear me talk it in terms of SPLA or SPLA based on its acronym. And we'll cover the Service Provider Licensing Agreement and how it works and who needs it, as well as how it came about and how to determine whether or not your traditional on-premises or enterprise subscription licenses will cover your use cases, and whether or not a particular use case runs afoul of the prohibition on commercial hosting that's contained in Microsoft's licensing rules. And what we'll learn is that if your use case involving Microsoft constitutes commercial hosting, then you're going to need to be looking at an alternative to traditional licensing metrics that are limited to internal use cases. Once we determine that a particular use case is commercial hosting, then we're looking at a hosting-based licensing model, of which the Service Provider License Agreement is one option. We'll look at the licensing alternatives for commercial hosting rights. The primary alternatives are either the SPLA or the self-hosting benefits associated with software assurance. For those of you who are not familiar with the term software assurance, it is the term that describes Microsoft's maintenance and support contract and service. So we'll talk about the alternatives in terms of commercial hosting, both using the benefits of software assurance, the self-hosting rights as they're referred to, and we'll talk about what constitutes a unified solution for those purposes, and then we'll talk about SPLA audits, because one thing that I've learned over the last 12 or so years in defending SPLA audit cases is they're different than typical Microsoft audits in many ways. The financial exposure in SPLA audits tends to be higher than what we see in traditional Microsoft audit matters involving internal use license agreements. And we'll talk about some strategies that we use in negotiating SPLA audit settlements, and we'll use the balance of any time that we have to answer any questions that you may have. If we don't get to your questions, I will endeavor to answer as many as I can offline via email. And if I'm not able to get to them, then hopefully we can answer your questions in a future session. So one of the biggest issues that we run into is trying to figure out whether or not a particular use case runs afoul of the prohibition on commercial hosting. And when I talk about the prohibition on commercial hosting, what we're talking about is that language in the standard retail and volume licensing terms that Microsoft uses that says that you cannot use the software for commercial hosting services. Unfortunately, commercial hosting services is not a defined term in any of the licensing agreements. So we're stuck with looking at what I'll refer to as extrinsic evidence. That would be evidence outside of the four corners of the license agreement to understand and interpret on a case-by-case basis whether or not a particular client's use cases violate this prohibition on commercial hosting. So you see that this licensing model was originally released in 1999. That's 18 years ago. And for those of you who don't have a great sense of the timeline, I'll submit to you that that's pre-cloud. But it was introduced in response to the growth in third-party commercial hosting. Back in those days, I was representing hosting companies, and the hosting company's basic strategy with respect to Microsoft licensing was that it was the customer's responsibility. They didn't worry about whether or not the servers in their data center were licensed appropriately for Microsoft, because it was their perspective that the customer was either going to bring their own license or that a regular internal use license was sufficient. And I would say that prior to the introduction of the Slaw model, it was unclear and in some cases unfair about how certain hosting companies went about licensing Microsoft products relative to the competition, and many hosting companies were competing on price and offering lower prices in large measure on Microsoft's back, namely offering to provide hosted solutions on Microsoft infrastructure where the licenses were insufficient or altogether not being paid for. And so the service provider license agreement was launched in 1999 primarily to address the rise of third-party commercial hosting. That, however, has changed pretty dramatically, because both in terms of outsourced IT, we've seen a shift from traditional managed services to hardware as a service, which for those of you who don't know what HAAS stands for, that's hardware as a service. And it's one of the stickier and more preferred models, I would say a precursor to cloud. And it had its sort of heyday in the last 5 to 8 years, where many of my clients were saying, Rob, look, I'm going into these environments. The customers have dilapidated infrastructure. They really need an upgrade of hardware in order for me to be able to maintain it on my platform in a cost-efficient way. However, from a capital perspective, they don't want to spend the money. So we're going to partner with a third-party financing company that's going to loan the money to acquire the hardware, and then we're going to bundle our maintenance and support services, our managed services, with a monthly payment that includes services and hardware payments on a lease. The third-party financing company provides the money for the hardware. The service provider gets to put the upgrade in and effectively reduce the labor associated with managing a rundown network, and the customer gets a new network, fully upgraded hardware, and a service contract for a period of time. And the issue was that because the customer does not own the hardware, the customer's licenses are not appropriate. And when you think about commercial hosting, the first thing you want to think about is who owns the hardware, because when it comes to Microsoft licensing in particular and software licensing in general, the obligations to license the hardware run with ownership, more so than access and use. So in these use cases, you'll see application providers, hosted backup and disaster recovery, hosted CRM, hosted messaging. These are all commercial hosting use cases, and you can see all of these solutions are very common and hot in the marketplace. The listing here about Scott & Scott is that Scott & Scott has been in the service provider licensing agreement for many years. Some of you know we have a software solution that goes out and takes an inventory of the computer software products that are installed on our clients' networks and returns them to our servers, where we have developed an application that analyzes that data and supports our practice of performing reconciliation work. That is a hosted solution, and it's licensed under the service provider license agreement. That's an example of a scenario that would constitute commercial hosting. The interesting thing about the Slaw is that it's one of the only Microsoft models that allows a user to true both up and down every month. While there are subscription-based models in other contexts, they rarely will allow you to go both up and down on a monthly basis, and this is the only one that really does that. And one of the things I like about it is that it is a very low capital intensive approach. From an accounting perspective, it's all OpEx, not CapEx. And for service providers, it's quite easy to match the licensing obligations to Microsoft with the customer commitments that they have on a monthly basis. If a customer rolls off, then you take that customer off your monthly report. If a new customer rolls on, then you add the subscriptions for that particular customer. The big challenge is, as I said, what constitutes commercial hosting? It's pretty clear in the product use rights and elsewhere that Microsoft has made it abundantly clear in terms of licensing that you may not host the products for commercial hosting services. Unfortunately, we don't have a definition, but we rely very heavily on that extrinsic evidence, including guidelines that have been published by Microsoft, including licensing briefs, charts, etc. They may not be enforceable against Microsoft in the terms of a contractual dispute. However, they would be good evidence in a case where the court found that the language commercial hosting was ambiguous, namely susceptible to more than one reasonable interpretation, and therefore would likely admit extrinsic evidence regarding the party's intent, and therefore anything that Microsoft as a party published about what constitutes commercial hosting, I think would be relevant and admissible as extrinsic evidence in that type of scenario. And it's instructive for us to walk through the two documents, the flow chart to help guide licensing decisions for Microsoft products, and this is a document, we call it the Slaw Qualifications Roadmap, that was last updated in 2011. What I like about this roadmap is it has a very good flow to it, and it provides you with specific questions, and then the answer to those questions as you go to a new question, and then it, in the end, helps to really illustrate, at least from Microsoft's perspective, what the issues are, how to go about analyzing this question of commercial hosting, and through this exercise, we're generally able to give clients some pretty good clarity and a pretty strong opinion about whether we think that a particular use case constitutes commercial hosting. So we're going to walk through some of these core questions and give you a sense of how we talk through these issues with clients. So the fourth question in the roadmap is the licensee, that would be the service provider, providing access to software applications used for third-party business operations? In most cases, the answer to this is going to be yes, in the sense that if you're hosting something for somebody, you're providing access for a customer, then the vast majority of the time that is third-party use for business operations. We generally don't see a lot of cases where the answer to number 4 is no, but obviously if the answer to number 4 was no, then you probably don't have a commercial hosting use case. Is the third party using the software application as a way to acquire goods or services from the licensee? This, number 5, is probably the most important question that we encounter. And I would say most of the cases that I look at turn on the answer to this question. And the best way that I explain this to a customer as to what does this mean is that a customer, a third party, is using the software application to acquire goods and services from the licensee if the solution is ancillary to the service. For example, e-commerce. Amazon is not hosting a website for a business in the commercial services sense. They've got an e-commerce site because they're a retailer. And people go to their website to acquire goods or services from the licensee. Another great example is online banking. You don't go to your bank's website because they're hosting an application for your business. You have a relationship with that bank to offer financial goods and services to you, and the website is a way for you to acquire those goods or services. And those are the two sort of prototype examples of a yes answer to number 5. If you wind up with a yes answer to number 5, you don't have commercial hosting. If you wind up with a no answer, namely that the third party is not using it to acquire goods or services from the licensee, then you have to continue down the path. So what would be examples of that? Well, everything on that first page that I showed you would be examples of that. Hosted BDR, messaging, infrastructure as a service, cloud, remote desktop services, all of these things where the application is itself the service. In addition, the hosting of third-party or proprietary applications on Microsoft infrastructure, where the service itself is a software service like CRM. So think about Salesforce on Microsoft infrastructure, or another CRM being hosted on Microsoft infrastructure, such as Dynamics, which would be a very easy example. These would be cases where the answer to number 5 would be no. And in many cases where the answer to number 5 is no, you have a commercial hosting use case. So assume the answer to number 5 is no. You move to number 7. Does the licensee own the business logic, content, or data and delivery the service and deliver the service under its own brand? This is there a proprietary solution that's owned by the licensee that's being bundled with Microsoft's infrastructure to offer a service? Even if that solution is being accessed not primarily to obtain goods or services from the licensee, if the licensee owns the logic, owns the content, and uses their own brand, then you have options other than SPLA if the answer to number 7 is yes. So I'll give you an example of 2 cases that I think illustrate what's going on in the question number 7. I have many clients that are in the business of offering Ediscovery services to law firms and corporations. For those of you who don't know what Ediscovery is, many court cases now, instead of everybody exchanging paper documents, many court cases now are disputed via the use of electronic evidence. Email records, business documents, electronic documents, text messages, etc. And there are a number of services and applications that allow law firms to process that data for production to the other side. And there are third-party providers that are engaged in having the software and services capability of taking that data from the law firm and rendering it in a way that is capable of being produced in a court case. That's Ediscovery. So this client A has got an Ediscovery platform that it developed on its own and is hosted on Microsoft infrastructure, Windows Server, and SQL backend, marketed under its own brand. And client B is hosting Relativity, which is a leading Ediscovery platform, third party. They have a license with Concura to offer Relativity to their customers, and they host it on Microsoft infrastructure. So client A has an answer to question number 7, yes, and client B has an answer to question number 7 as no, and as a result, these two clients have significantly different licensing options when it comes to how to license that environment. In addition, the SPLA roadmap has some annotated notes. So it's not just the question and answers. It has some annotated notes, which are very good in terms of helping us understand what these questions mean and giving us some specific examples so that we can guide our clients in evaluating each use case. And if we remember, I'm going to slide back to question number 4. Is the licensee providing access to the software applications used for third-party business operations? And then the guidance says if the answer to that is yes, Company A provides a software application for Company B to use. And scenario no, Company A hosts Company B's website. So traditional web hosting services gives you a no answer, and application hosting gives you a yes answer. That's what this guidance tells us. Number 5 is the third party using the software application as a way to acquire goods and services from the licensee. What does the guidance say? Yes. If customer of ABC Bank used the bank's online banking service, which is built on Microsoft software products to conduct their banking online. So the traditional online banking, as I mentioned before, prototypical scenario where the end user is accessing to acquire goods or services. The bank does not require a service provider license agreement to host its online banking application. Scenario no, Company A provides a customer relationship management application for Company B to support its customer engagements. This is the no answer to 5, which puts you into the commercial hosting context. The yes answer to number 5 puts you with internal use licenses. So question 7. Does the licensee own the business logic, content, or data and deliver the service under its own brand? What's the guidance say? Yes. A travel company with an online presence is using its own brand to sell its travel services. Now, this is the Expedia concept, right? Expedia has its own brand. If it's hosted on Microsoft infrastructure, it's selling its own travel services using its own proprietary software on its own brand, then that is a yes answer, and that company with the yes answer has the option to use SPLA or the self-hosting benefits associated with software assurance. The no answer company A is a travel company with an online presence that delivers a corporate travel portal branded in the name of company B. So again, in this scenario, if it's branded in the company B's name, it is no longer available to be used under the self-hosting benefits of software assurance and would require a service provider license. So what does this all tell us? How do we summarize this in terms of how these Q&As usually wound up, and what are the principal outcomes for most businesses? One is you've got internal use. This is your typical licensing, your volume license, your enterprise agreement, your OEM licenses, your retail licenses. That's what we're referring to as internal use. That's any of the traditional Microsoft licensing models. Third-party access, if any, is anonymous and unauthenticated. This is that web hosting scenario. People can come onto your network, your customers can come to your website, your customers can access your infrastructure anonymously and unauthenticated. That means public website is not commercial hosting and is internal use. No external client licensing is required. You don't need a way to give your individual customers who are accessing, provided that it's anonymous and provided that it's unauthenticated, there is no access license required. And the server license is permissible to be licensed under internal use. That's for both the SQL Server and the Windows Server. Internal use with external connectors. This is the answer to number 7, where you have the yes answer to number 7. It's your own brand. Then you can license internal use with external connectors. What this means is third-party access requires a license, right? And the services do not require commercial hosting rights. So just because the server is okay to be licensed under internal use, such as your Windows Server or your SQL Server, you still have to provide a way for that third party to access the equivalent of your client access license, and you're still going to be required to choose either a client access license, an external connector, which is a server-based client access license, or a processor-based license for that use case. So then we have the commercial hosting. Third-party access requires a client license. And you can choose between commercial hosting rights via SPLA or the self-hosted application benefits with software assurance if you qualify for software assurance, which means if your solution will be considered a unified solution, as that term is defined by Microsoft. So as Microsoft began looking at the decline in renewals associated with enterprise class agreements and a lack of enrollment in software assurance in select and other volume license agreements, it has increasingly set about to increase the benefits associated with software assurance. And some of those benefits, one of those benefits is that self-hosting of applications is allowed. So this is what we refer to as the self-hosting rights. offered through software assurance. But that self-hosting right, in order for you to qualify, the solution that you're offering has to meet the definition of a unified solution, which thankfully, unlike the definition of commercial hosting, we do have a definition of the unified solution. And it's these 4 bullet points that we see where under this section where it says the licensee software must. And the first one is add significant and primary functionality to the self-hosted applications that are part of the unified solution. Dashboards, editors, utilities are not primary services and or application of a unified solution. So significant and primary functionality, this is a real application. This is not something that is just displaying something that would be native in the Microsoft OS. This is a application that's built on Microsoft infrastructure that's going to be installed on the Windows server, and it's going to have more functionality than just an editor or a dashboard or a utility. Okay? Relatively easy hurdle to come over. The second one must be the principal service and or application and sole point of access to the unified solution. So if your application is a minor adjunct, say some kind of middleware or integration application, it's not going to meet this principal service and or application requirement. But take the example of the Ediscovery provider. The Ediscovery platform clearly meets the principal service test, and the point of the matter is that the customer is using the licensee's application is the access point. It's the UI of the customer experience is being presented through the licensee's application and not through, say, exclusively through a remote desktop access to a Windows Server environment where the application itself is doing something as a service running in the background. That would not meet this principal service and or application and sole point of access requirement. The next one, it must be delivered over the internet or over a private network from your data center to end users. The self-hosted application component may not be loaded onto the end user's device. True hosting. This is not a way to get around, fat client is not going to be permissible here. This is a true hosted application, software as a service model, not a fat client where you've got it loaded onto the end user's device. The next one, be owned, not licensed by you, except that your software may include non-substantive third-party software that is embedded in and operates in support of your software. This is that question number 7. Is it your IP? Is it your software or is it a third-party software? Now, if you own it and you've got some third-party plugins and you've got some stuff embedded from partners, that's not fatal. But going back to the Ediscovery scenario, if you're licensing relativity on your Ediscovery platform, for example, that customer B that I mentioned, it would not be owned by the licensee, and therefore it would run afoul of the requirements of a unified solution, and therefore would not be eligible for the self-hosted benefit. All access must be licensed. This is an interesting point that we see people run afoul of. So a lot of times what we'll see is a customer that's primarily not a hosting company, primarily a brick and mortar or other services, business, manufacturing or whatever, that's got some component of their business where they have third-party access via their customers, their vendors, or other third parties in their ecosystem. And they license the Windows server and the SQL server using the self-hosted benefits under their enterprise agreement. But when we start looking at their environments and start asking them, how is the access being licensed? That's where they get into trouble. In many instances, the use of an external connector license is the most appropriate way to license the access to the Windows server that is the unified solution, and that's being hosted as part of the unified solution. As I mentioned earlier, the external connection is a server-based license that covers all access. So the point here, in this point about all client access must be licensed, is that just because the server is licensed, it doesn't end the inquiry. You must license all of the access as well, even if you're licensing a unified solution and you meet all of the requirements, you still must license the access. When it comes to SPLA, if you don't qualify for the unified solution and you have a commercial hosting service, then SPLA is your only option. And generally what we do with most clients is we say, opt for the unified solution if you qualify, and if and only if you don't qualify for the unified solution, then get into a SPLA. There are two principal SPLA license types. Again, all of these are monthly subscriptions, and the subscriber access license, also known as a SAL, is the commercial hosting equivalent of what you might have heard of as a CAL, or a client access license. This is the access license for users. It's assigned to authorized users and permits an unlimited software deployment as long as they are accessed only by users to whom SALs have been assigned. Requires strict centralized server administration and the ability to accurately measure access. The big issue with SALs is the way Microsoft calculates use and defines the word use for purposes of users, and you must assign a SAL to anyone who's authorized to access, regardless of whether they access or not. So when I get involved in defending SPLA cases or helping clients get set up in SPLAs, one of the first things I ask them is, how do you count your users? And the most frequent answer is, we've got a counter on the server, and it tells us how many people logged into the server that month, and that's how we count. And it sounds totally logical. The problem is that those that actually access and those that are authorized to access are always different numbers. Because in any given month, the number of users that are authorized to access will frequently be substantially lower than those that actually do. And the licensing requirement, somewhat counterintuitively, based on Microsoft's redefinition of a commonly used word, use, has the effect of requiring licenses for people who don't use the software in a given month, but have the ability to do so. And so when we help clients with this issue, we help them set up and manage their Active Directories. We set timers for accounts to be deactivated so that they're no longer authorized to access after a period of time. The goal of all of those activities is to try to align the counts of those that are authorized to access to those that are due access, so that the customer, our client, is not paying substantially more money in any given month than they need to be given their users. The other option is to go with a processor license. This license is assigned to the hardware. It permits access by an unlimited number of users to each properly licensed server. It's more expensive and can entail somewhat more complicated accounting, but it's much easier to administer. For my larger clients where you've got large user counts, we almost always recommend to standardize on processor licensing, but there is a hurdle. Low user count environments are going to be cheaper and more cost-effective to license with a SAL. Processor-based licenses are going to be very expensive, but where you have high user counts, more cost-effective because they have unlimited users. So we've covered who needs a SPLA. We've covered some of the alternatives when you have an application that's customer-facing. How could you stay with internal use by qualifying for a unified solution? And now I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about, for those of you who are considering SPLA or already in a SPLA, to give you some insight into what happens when Microsoft audits your SPLA agreement. Microsoft has significantly and diligently pursued, particularly the larger hosting companies, on SPLA. Many of my enterprise agreement customers are now having to have SPLA agreements that run alongside their internal use case agreements for their third-party facing applications. And so this is not an issue that's limited exclusively to hosting companies and cloud service providers, but for those of you who are considering offering cloud services on Microsoft infrastructure, SPLA is going to be your only choice. So before you jump into it, or if you're already into it and you haven't had the learning experience of an audit, Microsoft has broad rights granted both in the newer SPLA agreements and under the Microsoft Business and Services agreements to come in and appoint an independent auditor to examine your reporting. And in many cases, that would be reporting going all the way back for a number of years. I've had cases where the look-back period that Microsoft wanted to examine was 5 years or greater, even though, the statute of limitations on a copyright claim, for example, would be 3 years. In many cases, statute of limitations on breach of contract claim would be 4 years. We still see Microsoft attempting to go back invariably to the inception of the customer licensee's inception of the agreement. So one of the things that we look at initially is, what do the agreements say? What's the scope of the audit? What contracts are being audited? Because SPLA agreements are 3 years in nature. If you get a SPLA audit in year one of a new agreement, but you had one before, it's fairly common that Microsoft will attempt to audit both agreements at that time. And so the first thing we look at is, okay, what's the scope? What are the entities that are included? What's the geography? And we try to limit that as much as possible. The next thing that we do is work with the appointed auditors. And all of these entities do SPLA audits. I would say KPMG does the most, but we've defended SPLA audits conducted by all 4 of these firms. And the first thing that we do before any information is shared, or before there's any kickoff calls, or before the engagement gets going too far, is we tell the auditors, we've got an agreement with Microsoft that covers confidentiality of our information. But you're independent of Microsoft, and we need an NDA in place with you. And in many cases, we negotiate a very specific NDA that's unique to SPLA cases. It's a little bit atypical of an NDA that you put in place in other audit matters. And generally, we're able to work that through with all of these firms over a period of between 2 and 6 weeks, although we've had cases where we've gone back and forth over an NDA in a big matter with a large client for 6 months, just negotiating the NDA. And from my perspective, I'm all right if the NDA process drags out, because that gives us some time to look at calculating. The one thing that our clients always want us to do in software audit matters is give them some insight into the audit exposure. What are we talking about from a financial perspective? Because we talk a lot to IT people, but invariably we're going to be talking to business people. And in my experience, business people are relying on us to boil all this tech and licensing stuff down to money. And the way that we do that is we calculate a financial exposure analysis. And the way that's done is we use the same formula that the auditors use. And it is a little bit counterintuitive, and I would submit to you, unique in software audit cases. The first step is to take a snapshot of the current month reported. So where are we relative to last month or this month? What did we have deployed and what did we report? In SPLA cases, your monthly report is your entitlement. It's not like other audits where you got to go scour the universe to determine what you own, because you own what you reported in a particular month. You don't own anything that you didn't report in a particular month. So SPLA cases are all about deployment analysis and what is deployed. So we work through and look at what is it in the current month. Let's say we reported 10,000 and we had deployments that would have, if paid up correctly, constitute 15,000. Therefore, we've got a gap in the audited month of 5 months. And what we're going to deal with is a roll back historical extrapolation, where the auditors are going to assume that you had that same usage from the inception and look at what you reported in each of those months, assuming that your current usage was your usage in those months, unless you could come forward and prove, which virtually none of our clients can do, that you had a different deployment count in those previous months. So they've got it set up to where they take the current month deployment and without having to go audit any prior month, can backwards extrapolate that number to the beginning of the agreement. This is why in SPLA audit cases, the historical exposure amount is almost always the biggest issue in dispute from a financial perspective. The concept of roll forward findings is this. It's typically many months from the time that the audit is conducted by the auditors and when the matter settles. So you take your snapshot for the audited month, you extrapolate backwards using this wild extrapolation factor that they use. And then on top of that, to add insult to injury, they roll it forward to the settlement date. So they're getting you coming and going, so to speak, both directions, backwards and forwards. Okay? In addition, unlike many agreements with Microsoft, the SPLA agreement has a penalty percentage built into it. It says that for any unlicensed use that's found in an audit, you have to pay, it used to be 1.15%, Now you have to pay 1.25%. So they're on top of the extrapolation going backwards and forwards. You have to pay a multiplier of 1.25. And then, again, to add insult to injury, they want to give you the bill for KPMG or Deloitte. Okay? So we can take the data from any client's SPLA environment in terms of the deployment data. We can analyze their monthly reporting, and we can build a financial exposure analysis which helps guide us in our approach to defending the case. One of the other things that's very important that we see in these cases is that Active Directory data is a primary source of validation when it comes to an auditor looking to validate the completeness and accuracy of the deployment data that's being offered. So typically in an audit case, the auditors will say, what kind of discovery tool do you have? If you have a tool that they're happy with, they'll accept it. If you don't have a tool in place, they'll recommend either their own tool, such as K-Scan by KPMG, or Map Toolkit, which is Microsoft's discovery tool. And then they'll take that data and then they'll give you a query for your Active Directory that'll go in and look at all users in your Active Directory. And then they'll look at your SAL reporting, your user-based reporting, and say, you've got 30,000 users in Active Directory, but you only report 5,000 SALs per month. Tell me why these other 25,000 users don't need a SAL. And if you can't give them a good answer, when they make their findings, they're going to say that their findings suggest that your counts were 30,000, and you've got a 25,000 user monthly discrepancy. And so managing your Active Directory, managing on the basis of those who are authorized to access, using security groups for each application, using tools to deactivate accounts after a period of time, typically anywhere between 30 and 90 days of non-use, are all strategies to mitigate against that risk. The other thing we see is in light of the long look-back periods, the rules have changed over time. For example, Windows Server licensing has changed from processors to cores, and these changes can affect the financial exposure analysis. So what are some of the issues that we encounter when we negotiate settlements? One of the things that we try to do before we get into any discussion of money is to reach an agreement, or at least to agree to disagree and understand the sources of disagreement between our view of the facts and what the auditors have come up with. And I will tell you, I've never been in a case where I think that what the auditors have come up with is fair to my client. I think the auditors have developed a program with Microsoft that's designed to make Microsoft more money. They take liberties with the licensing rules. They use assumptions that are in Microsoft's favor and not in the client's favor. And so I've never had a case where I agreed with what their findings were. But it's important to document those findings. It's important to be able to explain what those discrepancies and challenges are to Microsoft before you start getting into a discussion of the settlement terms. You can't settle an audit case if you see the facts one way and the publisher sees the facts in a wildly different way. You've got to try to close the gap, at least to narrow it to one or two or a small number of issues that can be negotiated and compromised, or else you're going to have a very hard time settling a case. So we always want to get to that factual accuracy. What the auditor's findings say this, the client's position is that's unfounded. And in a SPLA case, we look at two things at the time that the auditors hand their findings to Microsoft. Which are the things that the auditors got wrong, applying the licenses wrong, not looking at evidence we submitted correctly, ignoring licensing rules, etc. So mistakes, errors, things they got wrong. And then a second category of requested concessions. What are the things that the auditors didn't have the right to change, but that based on experience and history, Microsoft may be willing, in the interest of goodwill, to give a concession to a client on a point, this point or that point that would reduce the exposure. And so what we try to do at the handoff is within a week or so, give a written response to Microsoft regarding the findings, and that written response will include the challenges to the audit findings as well as requested concessions. And then you get into the nitty-gritty of the terms. How will it be paid? Over what period of time? What is the nature of the release of liability that's being received? What kind of audit forbearance? Namely, Microsoft has the right to audit every year under the terms of the agreement. Would they consider waiting 2 years or 3 years to audit again? So that's what audit forbearance is about. And then, of course, confidentiality, keeping the nature and terms of the settlement confidential. So what if you get into a dispute with Microsoft over a SPLA case, or more likely a case where you weren't in SPLA, but they come along later after you bought the perpetual licenses and claim that those perpetual licenses that you bought don't fit your use case, and now you have to go rebuy those same licenses for those same servers under a SPLA agreement, and you don't do that? Well, if you're in a SPLA agreement, you've got the potential that they terminate your SPLA agreement. If your hosting business is based on Microsoft infrastructure, you've got clients signed up to long-term services agreements involving Microsoft infrastructure, you really can't deal with the termination of your ability to offer SPLA. And if you're not in SPLA, you could face litigation and possibly injunctive relief in the event that you don't come to terms with Microsoft out of court. Most of the cases that I've handled with Microsoft are settled out of court. Occasionally, we will have to battle Microsoft in federal court, and I can assure you that it's very expensive for both sides. And in many instances, from a business perspective, my clients are telling me that their goals are to avoid litigation and reach a settlement. After all, the vast majority of my clients have, in many cases, good long-term relationships with Microsoft, and they're not looking to ruin those relationships over a dispute over a SPLA or any other licensing dispute for that matter. And so my marching orders are frequently to help the client reach a settlement that's fair and reasonable, and to have it documented and papered in a way that protects the client's interests. So we have just 1 minute for questions, so I'm not going to be able to take any questions during the call, but I encourage you to enter your questions into the bar on the right. I will take as many of those questions offline as I can and email or call you with a response. If you are a client of the firm, you are much more likely to have your questions prioritized at the top. If I'm unable to get to your question, I apologize in advance. And in many of these presentations, I wind up with way more questions than I can handle, but it looks like we've got a manageable amount so far. So I would encourage you to enter your questions. It looks like I'll be able to answer the questions that you have. So please take some time to do that. And as Anita said at the opening, we will be sending out an email to you to get your feedback on the presentation. And if anybody is interested in contacting me to discuss a matter involving Microsoft or any other matter of interest to your business that you might be seeking legal advice on, my contact information is here. That number that you see there is our main number, and the email address here minus this E is my email address. It's rjscott@scottandscottllp.com. And with that, I'm going to thank everybody for attending and look forward to seeing you at an upcoming event in the